Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and when we last left off with Sherman, the Battle of Shiloh was about to commence. If you haven't checked out the Teespring store, I've got all kinds of designs available for purchase. I even have a funny t-shirt depicting Sherman as a barbecuer with the name tag 1864 Barbecue Champion, Atlanta, Georgia. You can help support the channel by purchasing a shirt or joining the Patreon page, so you can choose the next general to be covered. If you want more information about the Battle of Shiloh, click the link in the upper right-hand corner to watch the full animated battle map for the Battle of Shiloh. At 5 a.m. on April 6, 1862, Confederate pickets 1 mile south of the Shiloh Church encountered the main battle line of Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnson's army. Soldiers came with word that a major attack by the Confederates were underway, but Sherman was unconvinced. He would ride to the scene of the firing personally. His orderly at his side would be killed, but he was still not entirely convinced of it being a major attack. At 8 a.m., Sherman finally could see the massive Confederate battle line and knew that a major engagement was underway. By that time, Sherman had formed his division into a battle line, but the Confederates were pushing their way onto the flanks of the Federal line. The Union soldiers fell back, but the Southerners had to battle for every inch of ground they gained. Many of the volunteers had never seen battle before, but Sherman held his line together, with occasional withdrawals when the Confederates swept around his flanks. At 10 a.m., Sherman's commander, Ulysses S. Grant, arrived in his sector. Grant complimented Sherman on his dogged stand, and then proceeded on to the other division commanders. As the battle raged, Sherman had 3 horses shot out from under him, showing how close he was to the front lines. When his aide got him another horse, Sherman stated, "Well, my boy, didn't I promise you all the fighting you could do?" The general was cool and collected, but concentrated on organizing each battle line when it fell back from too much pressure. During the fight, some buckshot hit him in the right hand and lodged in the bone. His wife falsely heard that his entire hand had to be amputated. Another round went through his hat, and a spent bullet hit him in the shoulder strap, but didn't cause any damage. By noon, Sherman had his arm in a sling, but still at the front, placing artillery to beat back an enemy attack, and even took the time to show a green artillery unit how to cut the fuses of the shells. Other than a stubborn stand along the road that became known as the Hornet's Nest, the rest of the Union troops fell back to Pittsburgh Landing, where Grant was organizing a solid defense. At 5 p.m., Grant told Sherman to prepare for an offensive the next day. At 11 p.m., Sherman ran into Grant again. The army commander was holding a lantern and chewing on a cigar. Rain was falling on the two men. Sherman was about to ask Grant what the plan of retreat was, but then stopped himself and said, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Grant responded, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." Sherman's old friends and now battlefield enemies, Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard and Braxton Bragg, shared Sherman's tent as the Federals had left their camps in the hasty withdrawal. The next morning, Grant organized a counterattack, reinforced by Don Carlos Buell's army and the division of Lew Wallace. When the Confederates finally broke and ran, it was Sherman who, with cavalry and some infantry, chased after the rebels. At a place called Fallen Timbers, Sherman engaged with the Confederate rear guard, made up of cavalry from Nathan Bedford Forrest's command. Forrest charged the blue troops and scattered them. However, Sherman was able to cobble together another line, but would soon withdraw back to the Shiloh church. When Sherman returned, the men gave a cheer, and Sherman complimented them on a great victory. One soldier remembered that if Sherman would have asked the men to push on to Corinth right then, that they would have done it without questioning it. The gruesome task of burying the dead and getting the wounded help began in earnest. Sherman entered the camp of part of Buell's army of the Ohio. Sherman had commanded some of the men in the defense of a bridge near Elizabethtown, Kentucky. They remembered him and cheered their former commander. Among one of the captured Confederates, he found a former student from Louisiana. They talked, and the former professor found that many of the young men who attended the academy were now in the Confederate Army. Sherman gave the young man a pair of socks and some clothing before heading off to distribute bandages to the wounded. Shiloh brought peace of mind to Sherman that he had longed for since childhood, acceptance and approval by his foster father, Thomas Ewing. Ellen wrote to Sherman telling him that her father couldn't hear Sherman's name or his deeds without becoming emotional, and she informed Sherman that Ewing was exceedingly proud of him. With one battle, the insanity charge had been wiped away, and he had gotten his foster father's approval. The praise got the attention of Washington, and with the urging of both Grant and Henry Halleck, Sherman was made a major general of volunteers. After seeing the horrors of Shiloh, Sherman wrote, I still feel the horrid nature of this war, and the piles of dead and wounded and maimed make me more anxious than ever for some hope of an end. But I know such a thing cannot be for a long, long time. Indeed, I never expect it, or to survive it. When Henry Halleck made it to Shiloh, Grant's position in the army lowered, and Grant now was going to leave. Sherman tracked him down and found him with his papers and desk outside of his tent. Sherman asked what he was doing. Grant responded, "Sherman, you know that I am in the way here. I have stood it as long as I can and can endure it no longer." Sherman urged him to stay. Sherman would say of Grant, he was not a brilliant man, but a good and brave soldier, sober, very industrious, and as kind as a child. Yet he has been held up as a careless criminal, a drunkard, tyrant, and everything horrible. After Shiloh, even though he was praised, his comrades, like Grant, were criticized, and he took exception to that. He described the newsmen as the most contemptible race of men that exist, cowardly, cringing, hanging around, gathering their material out of the most polluted sources. I have at times felt I would prefer to be governed by Davis, Beauregard, and Bragg than to be abused by a set of dirty newspaper scribblers who have the impudence of Satan. He also took up a letter-writing campaign against an Ohio politician who complained about the inadequacies of the Union High Command at Shiloh. Thomas Ewing joined the attack on the politician. It took over a month for the Union Army to make an advance on Corinth. When the town was captured, Sherman told his troops, "It is a victory as brilliant and important as any recorded in history, and any officer or soldier who has lent his aid has just reason to be proud of his part." But he cautioned this victory did not mean the war was over. The enemy had still to be shown that they must obey the laws of their country and not attempt its overthrow by threats, by cruelty, and by war. They must be made to feel and acknowledge the power of a just and mighty nation. I contend we are fighting for the supremacy of written law as against the rule of mere party and popular prejudice. Years later, Sherman addressed the Society of the Army of the Tennessee and said, "Who but a living witness can adequately portray those scenes on Shiloh's field, when our wounded men, mingled with rebels, charred and blackened by the burning tents and underbrush, were crawling about, begging for someone to end their misery? Who can describe the plunging shot, shattering the strong oak as with a thunderbolt, and beating down horse and rider to the ground? Who can describe the last look of the stricken soldier as he appeals for help that no man can give, or describe the dread scene of the surgeon's work or the burial trench?" After the capture of Corinth, Halleck dispersed the army through West Tennessee. Sherman set about repairing bridges, railroads, and reconstructed communications through West Tennessee and northern Mississippi. On July 22, 1862, Sherman became the military governor of Memphis. His time as a banker and property manager made him a great candidate to manage the city. It would be a Herculean task for Sherman because the war created a power vacuum, and many people tried to take advantage of the situation.